Our journey today begins in the town of Clonmel, Ireland, where honour was expected, demanded, and defended, not in courts, but with paces on the ground and with swords and bullets. Here, in an upstairs room above a quiet country inn in 1777, 25 Irish gentlemen gather to formalise the rules for resolving matters of honour. What they create that night will ripple far beyond the green hills of Tipperary, shaping duels all across Europe, America, India, and Australasia. Tonight they will forge the Code Duello, a set of 26 commandments laying out how a man should challenge, fight, and risk his life to defend his honour. The word duello comes from the Italian, which itself stems from the Latin word duellum, an old form of bellum, meaning war. The title of the document summarises exactly its function: to provide a code for a private war between two individuals, what we refer to today as a duel. Causes of these private wars could be almost anything that was seen to besmirch a man's honour, whether real or imagined. A glance held too long, a toast made without sufficient respect, a comment about family lineage, a slight over property, a long-held grudge, an argument that got out of hand, or a dispute over a woman. The list is so extensive as, among men of high standing, the line between insult and injury was often razor thin. While in theory any man could fight a duel, in practice this was not the case. Duels were almost exclusively the domain of the aristocracy and nobility, as here honour was held to a higher standard, and reputation was everything. The creation of the Code Duello itself emphasises this point. It was written by gentlemen, for the gentlemen of the age, not for the average working-class citizen who often could not read or write, and certainly do not have easy access to the muskets and the sabres, whose use was recommended in the code. Although duels could result in legal action, society often viewed them as private matters rather than public crimes. In the rare cases where authorities intervened, they were more likely to show leniency towards those of higher standing, especially since judges themselves, by the sheer level of education and property required to attain such a position, inevitably came from the ruling classes. They shared those values and often saw duels as a regrettable, but understandable, affair between gentlemen. Indeed, when James Dupree Alexander, the 4th Earl of Caledon, was brought to trial in 1826 for causing the death of Captain Boyd of the 87th Fusiliers in a pistol duel, he was acquitted by the court, and walked completely free, despite a man having died at his hand. In addition to his high social rank, however, one of the reasons the court imposed no charges was that it felt that the duel had adhered to proper procedures. It was the Code Duello that defined what was proper. It codified exactly what was acceptable. And so, if we return to those 25 gentlemen gathered in a small town in the south of Ireland, we find one of the key motivations for their meeting was that, prior to Code Duello, duels were taking place that could be described as anything but proper. The full list of the 25 Irish gentlemen who gathered in Clonmel has been lost to time, but some names do remain. One known attendee was Ambrose Bodkin, a Galway lawyer whose personal experience with dueling must have convinced him that a defined rulebook was urgently needed. It's said he once took part in a legendary duel that began on horseback with pistols, and when the pistols misfired, the combatants dismounted, drew swords, and then eventually daggers. Bodkin was stabbed in the chest, but survived. Although the precise details of the incident are murky, the tale has some credibility. Before the Code Duello, there was no universally accepted point at which a duel was over, so it is possible that such a lengthy duel could occur. Bodkin was also known as a man of some experience in this area. Indeed, contemporaries referred to him as the infamous duellist from the west of Ireland, and it is thought that he had been involved in as many as 6 duels when he walked into the inn in 1777. His presence at that meeting, a man who had a vested interest in dueling in the future, spoke volumes about the world he had previously encountered, an experience that no doubt motivated him to attend. Another story that further illustrates the absence of limits in dueling prior to the code is the popular legend of a duel that took place in 1765 between John O'Rourke and Henry Gallagher. In this apocryphal account, the two men are said to have fired 4 shots each, before one finally struck a fatal blow. But since flintlock pistols at the time could only fire once before needing to be carefully reloaded with powder and ball, the idea that both men stood and reloaded repeatedly brings an almost farcical edge to the tale. This might have been intentional. O'Rourke and Gallagher are 2 of the most common surnames in Ireland, and the story lacks key details. No location, no cause, no confirmed winner, suggesting it may be more myth than history. Yet the popularity of such a tale is where the real truth is found, as there is no doubt it was a reflection of real concerns within the upper classes. Indeed, when the Code Duello expressed explicitly in its 17th article that only 1 shot is to be exchanged between combatants, we could strongly infer that multiple shot duels must have been a real issue before this point. A further murky element in pre-code dueling was the role of seconds. These were men who came to observe the duel and were supposed to act as mediators or guarantors of fairness. Although the presence of seconds had been part of dueling for centuries, since the practice originated as a custom, there were variations across regions and an inconsistency as to how they were supposed to behave. The most notorious example comes from 1712 in a duel between James Hamilton and Charles Mohun. The 2 men fought with small swords in Hyde Park. Both were deeply wounded, and both would die from their wounds. But what shocked the nation was that when Hamilton, due to the extent of his injuries, lowered his sword to signal the end of his fight, Mohun's second, General George Macartney, stepped forward and drove his blade through Hamilton's body, killing him instantly. Since duels were supposed to be a fight over honour, and this was clearly a dishonourable act, it caused outrage, and the action made it into the national press, causing unwanted attention to dueling. It also raised questions about why Macartney was armed and within range of the active conflict zone, creating a need, therefore, to fully define the roles and actions of any other person present at a duel. Even closer to the Clonmel meeting, another infamous duel occurred in 1765, where William Byron, uncle to the famous poet, killed William Chaworth in a sword duel at the London Star and Garter Tavern. The duel was controversial because of how quickly it sprang up. The 2 men were having dinner and then were suddenly embroiled in a mortal struggle over a disagreement about how landowners should punish poachers. When the case came before the House of Lords, Byron was acquitted, but the episode left a stain on his reputation as the reason for the duel was viewed as quite trivial and not something someone should lose their life over. Byron became known as the Wicked Lord. He withdrew from society and lived in seclusion at his Newstead Abbey. The case revealed the need for a proper process before a duel could be declared, so that hotter tempers might cool before blood was drawn and life was lost. Although the 25 men in the meeting in Clonmel were all Irish, the high-profile nature of the previous 2 cases would mean they would, no doubt, have featured highly in their discussions as they mapped out the future of dueling. Indeed, these men in 1777 were meeting not to end the death and violence. They were men who believed mortal danger was needed so that honour could be tested. But what they were determined to do was to shape it. The choice of Clonmel was no accident. Nestled between the Comeragh Mountains and the River Shore, this quiet town in County Tipperary was already a place where justice was dispensed. As one of Ireland's assize towns, Clonmel hosted regular court sessions, grand juries, criminal trials, and civil proceedings. It was quite literally a place where disputes were resolved and the law interpreted. So when 25 Irish gentlemen gathered there in the summer of 1777 to write the law for dueling, their purpose aligned perfectly with the spirit of the place. Furthermore, Clonmel was also neutral ground, free from local rivalries or the influence of powerful families, and therefore offered a safe and impartial setting where the gentlemen could fully focus on the task in hand, not to abolish dueling, but to regulate it. They came to shape the rules that would govern the affairs of honour and bring order to the unpredictable. After all, lives were at stake, and if death was to occur, the gentlemen wanted to ensure it would be an honourable one. But the Code Dweller's first achievement was actually to make duels less likely. They were not to break out spontaneously in a tavern or at a public affair. That would be ungentlemanly and henceforth dishonourable. The code demanded that a formal challenge be issued, accepted, and handled through recognised channels. Mere insults or overheard remarks were not enough. Furthermore, the seconds were to seek reconciliation first. The challenger could assert his honour had been offended, but if the man being challenged apologised at that point, pistols were to remain in their cases and swords in their sheaths. In this way, the code raised the threshold for bloodshed and ensured a duel would only occur if the challenged man was fully committed to defending his honour with his life. And the code also made rash challenges less likely by giving distinct advantages to the man being challenged. First, he was allowed to choose the weapon, swords or pistols. Naturally, he would select the one in which he was most proficient, but if he chose pistols, the code also gave him the right to fire first. Contrary to later Hollywood depictions of quick-draw shootouts, or the notion of combatants standing back-to-back, turning, and then firing on cue, pistol duels under the code were actually turn-based. One man fired, and if he missed or failed to fell his opponent, the other man got to fire back. This structure meant the challenger had to be certain that his honour had been slighted. Indeed, so certain that he was willing to take a bullet for it. Sword duels, though often more prolonged, were ironically less lethal, because in Article 15 of the Code it stipulated that honour was satisfied once first blood was drawn. A single slash anywhere on the body could end the affair. However, if combatants chose to thrust at the neck or chest, rather than slash to draw first blood, sword duels could still turn fatal. Mastery of the sword was itself a deterrent against duels, and was one of the reasons fencing was so popular within the upper classes. After all, few men would challenge someone known to excel with the blade. The fact that swordsmen rarely got challenged, combined with the fact that disputes concerning reputation tended to involve older, less athletic men who had time to build theirs, meant that pistols inevitably became the more popular choice of weaponry. And pistol duels were a whole different story. While it might be thought that the code, in limited pistol duels to a single shot each, would make them safer, Article 13 ensured otherwise. It explicitly stated that this shot had to count. No dumb shooting was admissible, and shots must only be aimed at the head or the chest. To intentionally miss or to aim at an arm or a leg was deemed dishonourable. The code intended that pistol duels ended the matter of honour once and for all, without possible controversy or the possibility of a second meeting. As a result, deaths within pistol duels became more common. This meant that a man who issued a challenge knew exactly what he was risking. Standing 8 to 10 paces away from another gentleman who had both the right to choose the weapon he favoured and the right to take the first shot, aimed squarely at his head or his heart. He would be able to return fire, of course, but that was only providing the shot hadn't incapacitated him or killed him first. And so, in bringing order to dueling, the Code Duello also seriously raised the stakes of the practice. The duels that adhered to the code were carried out with deadly seriousness. As a result, duels became rarer within the upper classes. But that is not to say no duels occurred. Quite the contrary. The principles forged in Clonmel would spread far beyond the borders of Tipperary. Their influence would be felt worldwide and across the decades. The ink on the Code Duello had barely dried when it began its journey far beyond the quiet streets of Clonmel. In the late 18th century, these 26 Articles of Honour travelled not through royal decree or parliamentary act, but in the hands and pistol cases of the gentlemen who swore by them. Early copies were often handwritten, kept folded in leather compartments of dueling sets, ready to be consulted should an affair of honour arise. In this way, the code spread organically, carried by officers, merchants, and aristocrats who moved between Ireland, Britain, and the far corners of the empire. Indeed, proof of the code's dissemination can be seen as early as 1780, when Calcutta ruling council member Philip Francis challenged Governor-General Warren Hastings to a duel. Francis accused Hastings of deception in his governance of the state, and the matter was serious enough that Hastings felt compelled to defend his honour with pistols. As stipulated in the code, Hastings was given the first shot, which he then proceeded to miss, allowing Francis to return fire, striking Hastings in the side of his chest and leaving him bedridden for weeks, but ultimately able to recover. Honour was deemed satisfied, and therefore Hastings overcame the charge of corruption and continued to govern Calcutta for years to come. It was not long before the code found its way into print. The most famous publication came in 1838, when John Lyde Wilson, a former governor of South Carolina, published the Code of Honor, a slim 22-page guide to the etiquette of the dueling ground. Wilson's booklet became a pocket companion for American gentlemen, covering not just the mechanics of a duel, but also the conduct expected of seconds. Its following edition went a step further, reprinting the full text of the 1777 Irish Code Duello as an appendix, thereby cementing its influence in the Americas. By the mid-19th century, extracts from the code were also appearing in military conduct manuals and etiquette books aimed at officers, lawyers, and the landed classes. Works such as Hints on Etiquette and The Gentleman's Manual of Modern Etiquette devoted sections to affairs of honour, instructing readers on the correct form of a challenge, the duties of a second, and the acceptable outcomes of a duel. Advice often drawn directly from Clonmel's original articles. Perhaps the most famous duel to prove the influence of the Code Duello was the deadly clash between Andrew Jackson and Charles Dickinson. The meeting took place in May 1806 on a dueling ground in Kentucky. Dickinson had insulted Jackson's wife and accused him of cheating in a horse race. Provocations Jackson could simply not ignore. And so, following the code, Dickinson, as the challenged man, fired first, striking Jackson less than 2 inches from his heart. Wounded, but unflinching, Jackson took deliberate aim and returned fire. The bullet shattered 2 of Dickinson's ribs and tore through his stomach, causing massive internal bleeding. Dickinson collapsed almost immediately and died later that evening. The duel almost certainly enhanced Jackson's reputation. This episode fed directly into the larger-than-life persona that later powered his political career. Jackson was already known as a lawyer, land speculator, and militia leader, but after the duel, he became the man who would not back down from any fight, whether on the dueling ground or the battlefield. Dickinson was considered one of the best marksmen in the region, and so the fact that Jackson stood his ground, took a bullet to the chest, and still killed his opponent, cemented his image as a fearless, unyielding, and formidable man. He would go on to serve 8 years as the 7th President of the USA, from 1829 to 1837. This, then, was the very test of character the 25 gentlemen had envisaged when drafting the Code Duello. Jackson had risked his life and proved his honour. He was not merely accepted back into high society, he was celebrated. But surviving this test was not without its cost. The bullet lodged near his heart and remained there, causing chronic chest pain, infections, and shortness of breath for the rest of his life. And so, whether encountered in a leather-bound compendium or on a single-folded sheet tucked beside a pair of pistols, the message was the same. The gentlemen of Ireland had determined the definitive way to settle disputes of honour, and their peers across the world had agreed. But, as the 19th century wore on, new forces, legal, social, and political, would begin to challenge the duel's place in polite society and would ultimately signal the end of the code. By the middle of the 19th century, the world that had given rise to the Code Duello was changing rapidly. Industrialization was reshaping economies, railways were joining nations together, and the rise of professional police forces and legal systems meant that upper-class disputes could increasingly be solved by calling in state assistance or settled in courtrooms rather than on fields at dawn. The romantic image of the duel began to clash with the practical realities of a more orderly, law-abiding society. Although dueling had been illegal for some time, enforcement was previously rare. But this too began to change. Increasingly, duelists faced real legal consequences, and the social prestige once attached to such encounters began to erode. For example, in 1843, when Colonel Quentin and Captain Harvey Tuckett fought a pistol duel at Wimbledon, despite the fact that neither man was seriously injured, they were both arrested and both fined £100, a serious sum at the time. It was also a blot on their careers. Colonel Quentin, near the end of his service, was able to keep his position, but Captain Tuckett was forced to take a colonial posting to escape the scandal. This incident reflected a broader shift within the armies of Britain, France and Prussia, who all now had had time to reflect on the experience of the Napoleonic Wars. Dueling, once seen as the highest expression of honour for an officer, was now increasingly viewed as dishonourable. The belief that an officer's first duty should be to his regiment and not himself now began to take precedence. As a result, men with a history of dueling were often passed over for advancement, further reducing the appeal for ambitious gentlemen in uniform. Another key turning point came in 1829 when the Duke of Wellington, hero of Waterloo and then sitting Prime Minister of Britain, fought a pistol duel with the Earl of Winchelsea. The quarrel stemmed from political accusations over Wellington's support for Catholic emancipation. The affair might once have been celebrated as a gentleman's defence of honour, but instead it caused national outrage. That a man holding the highest political office in the land should risk not only his life, but the stability of his government over a personal slight was seen as absolutely reckless. Wellington's shot was deliberately wide. Winchelsea fired into the air. Honour was satisfied, but the damage had already been done. Wellington's duel damaged his overall reputation, and was proof that public opinion had begun to turn. One reason for this change was the rise of national media. Newspapers became accessible to a wider public, whose literacy rates were growing, and they began shining a light on what had once been an exclusive, private ritual of the upper classes. They condemned duels in scandalous terms, as barbaric relics of a feudal past, especially when public servants were involved. In addition, insurance companies began to refuse to pay out on policies for men killed in duels. These factors, combined with the threat of legal prosecution, released the hold Code Duello had on upper-class society, and, within 100 years of its inception, it had largely faded from use. Indeed, the last known fatal duel in Britain took place in 1852, when Lieutenant Colonel Fawcett shot dead Lieutenant Munro in a dispute over a card game. In Ireland, pistol duels persisted into the 1860s, particularly in rural areas, though by then they were rare enough to attract sensational press coverage. In the United States, the last notable duel under formal rules occurred in 1859, when Senator David Broderick of California was killed by former Chief Justice David Terry. After this, the Civil War turned the nation's appetite against organized personal violence for many years to come. France proved to be the great holdout. There the duel survived well into the 20th century, especially among politicians and journalists. The very last recorded duel actually came in 1967, when Gaston Defferre, the mayor of Marseille, said, "Shut up, stupid," to socialist politician René Ribéry in the French National Assembly. Ribéry, following the code, demanded satisfaction in the form of a duel, and the two men met with épées in a private residence in Neuilly-sur-Seine. After Defferre drew first blood, the seconds halted the conflict with little injury, but the world looked on aghast that such an event could actually have taken place. And so, it was at this point that the Code Duello finally passed into history. But listen closely, traveller. Do you hear it? The clash of steel, the sharp crack of the pistol, the faint gasp as the shot finds its mark. This was a different age, an age where honour was measured at the risk of one's own life. Perhaps if you were to wander the dueling grounds at daybreak, you might glimpse for a moment the ghosts of the past, the seconds pacing the distance, the duelists raising their pistols or steadying themselves for the first shot. And what of the 25 Irish gentlemen, Did their code enshrine the highest ideals of courage and conviction? Or was it a flawed relic, misguided, and born from a harsher world? Perhaps it was both. But fear not, traveller, for like all such echoes in history, the Code Duello remains just a whisper in time.